So I think it was about 2 weeks ago you said that it's unlikely the Fed can engineer a soft landing, and it sounds like everyone was listening to you because markets felt like they started to turn. Recession fears came in, inflation expectations fell down. Has anything changed in your mind?
No, I think in fact it's gotten more pronounced that we live in a world of trade-offs. So central bankers face a very difficult set of choices. They can either bring inflation down, but at a very heavy cost to the real economy. They'd have to essentially crush demand, raise interest rates very much in order to get inflation anywhere near the 2%. Or they can, at some point, accept that that cost is too high and you tolerate for some time higher inflation. You know, the only good news is I do believe we have reached peak inflation. Inflation will start to come down as financial conditions tighten, as central banks normalize rates. But we're not going to get to 2% without significant damage to the real economy.
That reminds me of what Jim Reeds over at Deutsche Bank said recently, that central banks, they usually stop hiking and start the cutting project, not necessarily when inflation gets to 2%, but when the trend is lower. If we have reached the peak in inflation, does that mean a cutting cycle might be sooner in the cards than perhaps markets and many people are expecting?
Oh, I think we're a long way away from that. The question will be whether at some point they pivot to tolerating higher inflation for some time. You know, for many decades, we've lived in what Ben Bernanke has coined the great moderation, which was essentially if you brought inflation down, everything else would be fine as well. This is no longer the case. The cost of bringing inflation back to 2% is now very, very high. And I believe that's going to become more and more apparent, at which point we're going to start to see the central banks facing this very difficult choice.
Wait, so what is that cost? Is it 5% unemployment for 5 years, like Larry Summers says?
I think it'll be in that kind of, deep recession territory if you wanted to really get inflation back to the kind of price stability definition that we've seen in the last decades, around 2%. I think that the cost of that will prove to be extremely, extremely high. And that's the new kind of world we live in. This is a very new era where you can't just get everything right if you stabilize inflation. There was a term in economics called divine coincidence, that if you could stabilize inflation, everything else would work out just fine. I don't think we live in that world anymore. And the reason for it is that this inflation regime is driven largely by the supply side. This is driven by the production side of the economy, not by excessive demand.